Good morning, everyone. My name is Tokumbo Joe. I'm the Associate Dean Student in the Faculty of Grad Studies. Welcome to this webinar series on Applied Quantitative Research, a practical guide for grad student researchers. This is the part two of this webinar. This session that you are in today will provide you with variety of options for quantitative data generation, known as data collection. The focus will be on two common methods used in applied quantitative research: individual interview and focus group. The framework from this webinar is to guide decision making around data generation will be shared and include important no question to consider through the data generation phase of the study. Our presenter today is Dr. Karen Campbell. She's an assistant professor in the School of Nursing at York University. Dr. Campbell research focuses on intersection of women's health, weight, physical, and social geography. She has taught grad level courses in quantitative research and designed and conducted multiple applied research projects using broad range of study design and approaches to analysis. On this note, I hereby welcome Dr. Campbell.
Thank you very much. Thank you for all of you that are joining. And I see there's a few more people coming in. So thanks for that introduction. And this is the second webinar that we're doing. So just as a refresher, the first webinar we discussed about applied qualitative research. So applied qualitative research being research that is really pragmatic or practical. Oftentimes, because I'm a health researcher, we're doing research that really requires answers now. And so we take some of the rigorous methods that come from our traditional qualitative methods or designs like phenomenology, grounded theory, and ethnography, and then we apply them on a much more practical basis so that we can do work that's a little bit faster, but still just as rigorous. And today I'm going to talk about data generation. And I use the term data generation rather than data collection because I'd like to recognize that this isn't something that just happens to be out there on the street and you can pick it up. You're actually doing something really intentional to create this data. So that's why we use this type of terminology, but it is often referred to as data collection. We're just trying to shift the needle a little bit. So the plan here for today is to discuss a framework that we use to guide decisions around data generation. So I hope that some of this is helpful to you. I hope something is new for you, or at least that you feel vindicated in the work that you've done, and maybe it reaffirms something that you already knew. I'd like to share a variety of options for data generation, including individual interviews and focus groups. And I'd like to pose some important questions throughout to help you consider what you're doing through the whole phase of your data generation process. So this is all based on a paper, and I think you can click on the QR and find this paper, but it is based on a paper that we wrote for the Journal of Human Nutrition and Dietetics. Again, this is actually part of a series on applied qualitative health research, but this is where the information comes from. So just to recognize my colleagues, Dr. Jack Whitmore and Cameron. Last time we did talk about reflexivity, and just to recognize that overall, whenever we engage in reflexivity before we come to data generation, it really sets the stage for an ethical, rigorous, and thoughtful way in which we come about our research. So recognizing that as we move into this part of data generation, it helps us to acknowledge our biases and our assumptions. And when we do that, it really shapes how we design the study and how we choose to collect the data and how we choose to move through that portion of data generation. Also, it will help to improve your research design. Again, being aware of your positionality helps us to make more informed decisions about who we choose as participants and why we're choosing those particular participants. Maybe how we even choose the strategies which we're going to generate data. It enhances our credibility, fosters our ethical awareness. It also helps to clarify what exactly is the relationship between the researcher and the participant. And I think that that's really important as applied qualitative researchers, because we often are invested in the outcome of what we're doing with the people we're working with. And when we are reflexive about what we're doing, it helps to keep us in alignment with the research. That's supposed to be research questions, but the research and largely the research questions, thinking about what are our motivations, our interests here, and are we asking the right questions to the right people to get to answer our research problem. So today I'm going to share with you our framework, and our framework for data generation is largely around 6 questions that we've asked. And in the paper, we go into a little bit more detail around questions that you can pose in relation to this. But I'm going to walk you through some of those 6 questions. I'm going to walk you through all of those 6 questions today. And the first one is, who is involved in data generation? So who are the people that need to be involved in this part of your study? And we want to think about the expertise. So does the researcher have the relevant expertise or experience with the topic area to do this? Do they have enough research experience to be able to do interviews or other techniques that are going to help with data generation? And when you think about things like the relevant experiences, so does the researcher have some sort of personal tie to this? So oftentimes we might see, I work in the area of violence against women, and oftentimes there are women who have themselves experienced violence that are doing this work, or have experienced childhood maltreatment. And it's important to consider, if that is who you are and that is who is doing the research, how much of that is going to be shared with the participants, because that may help and it may not. So to, again, be really mindful and conducting or practicing reflexivity will help to identify what that will look like. Engagement. So thinking about who will conduct the data generation episodes. So who is going to be doing the interviews, who is going to be doing whatever techniques you choose, focus groups or whatnot, who is going to be doing them? Does it have to be the researcher? Can it be the researcher? So sometimes you may be in positions where you're not the one that's able to interview. And so how can you help to inform the data generation when you're not the one that's able to do the interviews? And sometimes that's because of internal policies or ethics that have interfered with that, or even if you've got a personal relationship with somebody, and so you choose not to do that interview and somebody else does it instead. How will participants or partners or other people with experience be engaged in the process? So you may even find that you want these other groups to be involved during the time that you're deciding who you're going to talk to and what kinds of questions you're going to ask. Sometimes it's helpful to think about how you want to bring those people in. Are they going to be participants, or are they going to be advisors? What exactly, or both? What exactly is that going to look like? And also the involvement, particularly around when you're doing observations. If you're doing observations in perhaps a focused ethnography study, for example, to what degree are you in that world? So are you having passive participation where you're just observing, or are you having complete and active participation in there? And all of those options across that spectrum are fine. It's just that we want to be sure that we're considering what that is. Also, if you are a health researcher, I think it is important, or if you're in another discipline where there is the duality of both being a clinician of sorts and also being a researcher, I think it's important to set out what the boundaries are there. So what are you going to tell the participant and disclose to the participant about your role, and how are you going to make it clear about what the boundaries within that are? The next question is around what types of data will be generated. I'm sorry for how wordy these slides are, but I did want to, well, the next one, I did want to make sure that you could pull some of this information that makes sense to you. And the types of data that will be generated is probably your main question here around what are the data source and what are the data generation strategy that is most appropriate to answer your research question. So these are some of the questions that you might think about within that, making that decision about what type of data will you generate. And I'm just going to flip to the next slide so I can tell you what those data sources are. So the data sources are things like individuals, teams, groups, community members, charts or records, any journals, any policies or documents. So there's lots of different options here. And this, when we talk about generation strategies, we're talking about things like interviews, observations, documents, drawing maps, creating timelines, taking photos or videos. So again, lots of different options around what this looks like, and lots of different ways to elicit. So different elicitation strategies that can help you to use these generation strategies. And we just want to make sure that, again, that the strategy that we're using aligns with the data sources that we have, and making sure that we are in the right place at the right time to ask these to generate this data. So just to go back to this slide, a few other things that you want to think about. Is the data generation strategy congruent with the study design? So in some studies, it may be less likely that you want to do something like observation, or maybe less likely that you want to look at documents. And other study designs, like a narrative method, is much more likely to look at journals or having somebody journal for you. So thinking about the style and the congruency. And if you were at my first webinar, you know that I'm really big on making sure that the decisions you're making are congruent with your design, so that everything lines up. Can you use more than one data source? And can you use more than one data generation strategy? Absolutely a good question to think about here. Does the strategy consider the participant characteristics? So when I talk about this, I'm thinking about things like, if you're, this is an example of a real study from Carter et al. At McMaster University. Carter did a study with men who had prostate cancer, and as part of her data generation strategy, she chose to have focus groups. But these were older men that had prostate cancer, and they came together in a group to talk about how this was impacting their sex life. And it did not work well. It was a complete flunk, because the men were not open to talking about limitations of their sex life caused by their prostate cancer in a group with other men. Even though they had the same issue, it wasn't something that they felt comfortable with. So it wasn't a strategy that worked. So thinking about the participant characteristics will help you to identify what's the right strategy to use. And again, are there other tools that you can use to help enhance the richness? And I'll go through some of that. Does the elicitation tool that you're using fit with the strategy? And do you need extra time with participants to provide instructions for implementing data elicitation techniques? And I will go over this in a moment, but just to say that if you are using something like body mapping or other techniques during your interviews, make sure that you build in that extra time. So be really cautious about the number of questions that you have in your interview guide if you do want to use other techniques as well. Even something as simple as journaling. If you're asking participants, and in my master's level study, I did work with adolescent mothers that were living in rural communities, and I did a narrative study. I talked to these young women, and I asked them to journal their thoughts on what it was like to be a mother in this rural community for a 2-week period, and so to give them really clear instructions is really helpful. And I will say that was another failure or learning experience. Maybe I should flip that to the positive. It was another learning experience because it did not work well. And none of the participants returned a journal in that study. So make sure that you're giving them enough prompts that they understand exactly what it is that you want them to do and how you're going to collect that. So I want to talk a little bit more about interviews. And interviews and focus groups are essentially the same thing. The difference is the number of participants that's essentially the difference that we're seeing here. But interviews are characterized by the structure of them. So we see interviews that range on a continuum from structured to unstructured. And generally in applied research, we're somewhere here on the semi-structured side. This is where we want to be. Oftentimes, unstructured work is more like an ethnography, maybe a phenomenology study. So these traditional methods where you may go, even a grounded theory study where you haven't even done a literature review, and you are really going in with the intention of finding out what you need to find out from your participants. So to ask them questions like, what's it like? What's it like to be a young mother in a rural community? And that's it. That's your only guiding question, and you see where it goes from there. It is more likely that you're in this space of semi-structured, especially if you're doing applied research. And this is a good place to find out about people's knowledge, attitudes, beliefs, expectations. So those types of studies that are looking at what motivates people to do the things that they're doing. Oftentimes structured interviews are more likely used in quantitative research. They are sometimes used in qualitative research, but they tend to be really focused on something very particular, like an event, a process, a structure. And in structured interviews, we ask the same questions in the same way, in the same order to every person. They tend to be more closed in the answers that you may get. Whereas a semi-structured interview, you can have 6 or 8 questions that you go in with the plan to ask, but you may not ask them in the same order every time, and you may not end up finishing them. Oftentimes with the work that I have done the with young mothers that were in a public health nursing program, we were looking at how the nurses were implementing this program in British Columbia. And what we found was that some of the interviewers would ask 2 questions, and they would get such rich answers from just those 2 questions that they never even got to question 4, 5, and 6. But we did have other people on the team that then could make sure that 4, 5, and 6 were answered with other people at another time, and also gave freedom to the interviewers that were able to elicit such rich data from the participants that they could stop after 2 questions, because what we found out during those 2 questions was exactly what we needed, even though we didn't finish. The difference is that when you're not asking every question in the same way, you do need to be very, very mindful of not saying X number of participants answered this way. So if we don't give everybody the opportunity to answer the question, we can't say that they've all had this experience or that they all didn't have this experience, because if we didn't ask them, we can't say that it didn't happen. So just to be mindful about that. And again, we tend to be working in this semi-structured area. So again, we can have individual interviews, those one-on-ones, and they're really helpful whenever we want to get really rich data that helps us to get at somebody's motivation, at something that's deep intrinsically into somebody. For example, the prostate cancer patients with prostate cancer that were having sexual dysfunction, they're probably more likely to share their experiences in a one-on-one rather than in a group. Oftentimes we have dyads as well, and dyads might be a team that works together. It may be parents, it may be partners. And when you're working with groups like dyads like that, you do want to think about the how you're going to include those people. So if you're working with parents, are you interviewing parents together as a dyad? And if you are, how are you going to structure that interview so that you can encourage both parents to have the opportunity to speak? And when you do those interviews, it's also really important to think about what's happening when you ask the questions. When you ask a question, is one person more likely to answer than the other? Do they look at each other whenever they're talking? So these types of things that you're seeing in interviews where you have more than one person are really, really important to then document afterwards. I am going to talk a little bit more about focus groups, so I'll hold off on that. But again, really important to think about why you're doing interviews this way. So if you are interviewing parents, you can interview a parent 1 and parent 2, or you can interview parents together. And if you're interviewing them together, just be really clear on why you're doing that, because you do have the benefit of seeing how the parents interact together. And so that then becomes data, and make sure you collect that. There's also multiple modes of how you can collect the data. So thinking about whether you want it to be in person, but it can also be over the phone, on video, over text. There's many, many ways in which we can collect data now. So when you're making your plan, just to be thinking about how you want to do this and what you want to use. Again, asynchronous is tends to be difficult. Tends to be difficult, but you do. Oh, I don't know how I did that. It tends to be difficult, but it is an option, and it may give somebody enough time to think about and process how they want to answer their questions, which may be helpful for some people. So the work that we do in women who've experienced violence, where there's traumatic brain injuries, they may need a little bit more time to process what questions you're asking. So in a one-to-one interview, they might not answer the same way as, in an in-person interview, they might not answer the same way as if you give them the questions and give them some time to draft a response to you or think about how they want to respond. When you're considering your interview guide, always start with your research objectives and your questions. And I actually think it's a great idea to post them on the wall in front of your computer, so that you've got your research question and your objectives clearly laid out, and they're always at the front of your mind, because those questions should be exactly what you are going in with. And oftentimes, because we want to build rapport, especially whenever we're doing individual interviews, we want to build rapport with the people that we're talking Absolutely. Absolutely, we want to do that. We want to make sure that they're comfortable, that what we're saying to them is clear and understandable. So we're not going to say things like since your TBI whenever we're talking about traumatic brain injury. Like we want to make sure that we're not using medical jargon, um, even whenever it's something that's really second nature to us, and maybe it is to them too, um, but always go to the place where you're clear and simple, remembering that they're about to share something with you that's incredibly personal on some level, even if it's we again we're doing work with public health nurses and how they deliver a program. So it's their job. It wasn't, we weren't talking about their sexual dysfunction after prostate cancer, but they're still telling us something where we want them to trust that we're not taking this back to their employers, that they're not getting in trouble for what they're about to say. So we do want them to feel comfortable right from the beginning. And so to do that, we want to create a situation of rapport. I tend to dislike the idea of doing like an icebreaker kind of question. So sometimes you'll hear people ask questions like, what's your favorite type of ice cream? Just to kind of lighten the mood and to ask a question. But unless your research question is about flavors of ice cream, I don't think it's a good question to start with. There's lots of other ways that you can start to build rapport that don't involve wasting your time. You only have people for a limited period of time. And I'm going to talk about that as well, but you'll only have them for a limited period of time. So if you do, use your time really wisely. So think of an opening question that might be broad enough that you allow them to answer it however they want to answer it, that gives them freedom, that makes them feel comfortable, but it's still related to what your question is. And then move more into the specifics. This is just my this is my preference, but your supervisors may have a different perspective. In which case, please listen to your supervisor, or back yourself up and say, yeah, no, I really feel strongly that this would be a better question because it has the same purpose of breaking the ice, but is also related to this area. Um, be spontaneous, allow for spontaneity. So if there's something that comes up that's not on your interview guide, it wasn't part of your prompts, go with it, go with the flow of it, and allow them, walk them down that line, even if it's not something that was part of your guide, as long as it answers your question. So there's lots of information that gets collected in qualitative interviews that is interesting but won't answer your question. And again, the study that I did with young mothers that were living in rural communities, it was about their experiences of parenthood after giving birth. And it was so interesting that some of them talked about the motivation to have this baby, and how they had previous one individual had a previous abortion, and people found out about it in town, and she was worried when she became pregnant that if she had another abortion that people would really judge her for having two. And so she had the baby because everybody knew her business. So interesting, the motivation of her becoming a parent, because she was worried about what people would feel or the morality there. Um, but it didn't answer my research question, so that's okay. It's a great jumping off place where you can say, all right, so like guide me back. You can help guide them back into your research question because it's so clear and it's right up in your mind. I also think it's a good idea to pilot test these, and for two reasons. One is about the jargon. So if you pilot test this with a friend, with somebody that you trust, it doesn't even have to be somebody that has the experience of it, but that they understand the questions and that you get the practice of asking the questions, especially while you're starting out. So if you're not familiar with these types of interviews, I highly recommend just doing a pilot test with anybody. That way you can change and modify your approach or your questions if you need to. Um, I don't tend to pilot test with participants because I feel like that that pilot test is data. Like that is your first participant. And you can change your interview guide at participant 1 or 2 or 5 or 10. It doesn't matter. So all of the time you're constantly thinking about, was this the right way to ask the questions? Are there particular questions that people really aren't understanding or questions that they love answering? And you want to make sure that you are being aware of that and flexible in that space. And be flexible, be kind, be considerate, be aware of cultural humility, all of those types of things that help you just to be a good researcher and perhaps a good human being. Um, I'm happy to take more questions at the end about interview guides, but I do want to talk a little bit about focus groups as well. So focus groups Focus groups are interesting. And the first thing that I want to say about focus groups is about when not to use them. Don't use them because it's convenient, and don't use them because you want to have more participants. These are bad reasons to use them. If it's not convenient for you or for your participants, fix that problem first. If you'd like to have more participants, then interview more participants and give yourself more time to do it. If you have 10 participants, and I think six to eight tends to be a good number for a focus group. But they can absolutely, we've done focus groups with as low as 2, which I mean might be a dyad, but let's say we still used our focus group guide. So we've done them as low as 2 and maybe as high as I think 20, which becomes very, very difficult to manage. So 6 to 8 is probably a good place to be. The reason why you want to do focus groups is because you want to think about how these people are interacting together. So you want to do things that are encouraging interaction between the members or encouraging them to think about something from one angle and okay, does anybody have a different perspective on this so that there's more of a debate going or idea sharing. We're doing interviews with healthcare practitioners about how they assess intimate partner violence. And so when they're together, they can say, oh yeah, actually, I never thought about that. I do that as well, so that there's multiple people can think about things from different perspectives. So that's kind of why you want to do a focus group. You want to do a focus group because there's a reason to get those people together. If you have 6 to 10 people or whatever it is, your N for a focus group, your N still equals 1. It's not the number of individuals that you have, it's the number of data generation episodes that you have. So if you interview 10 people, you have an N of 10. If you do 4 focus groups and each focus group has 40 unique individuals, you don't have an N of 40, you have an N of 4, which is fine. That's what it should be, but just to be cautious of how you report that because you will get called out on it, certainly in peer review. We want to be even broader in the questions that we're doing. So when you're writing a focus group guide, the questions should be open-ended, just as they would be with an interview guide, an individual interview guide, but much broader and less specific. So if you want to get into that more specific stuff, also maybe do a few interviews, which is always an option. And usually when we do focus groups, we also tend to give people the option that if you can't attend a focus group, we'll do a one-on-one interview with you. And so that's a good thing to include into your ethics guides. You need a good moderator for a focus group. So you need a good moderator so that the moderator is able to ask questions, to identify who's talking and who's not talking, so that they can encourage multiple people to talk however they choose to do that. So sometimes it might be doing a round robin where you have each person answer a particular question and then people responding in between. But again, it does require a strong moderator to do that. And I often think that it's good to have a recorder. So So if you can find two people to attend focus groups, it will work better. And in fact, we're doing a larger type of focus group in May, where we are having I think eight or so recorders. And part of the reason for that is that the recorder is responsible for also identifying what are the dynamics between the groups. So we did focus groups with the public health nurses that were running the Nurse Family Partnership Program. And when we did that, we wanted to see how they supported each other. Or not, but in this case, they did support each other. So the recorder was writing down things like when somebody seemed tearful, other people came around, like they moved their chairs closer to her. They gave her water. They handed tissues over to her, things that aren't going to be available on a transcript. So you really want to make sure that you're mindful in that. And it's difficult for a moderator to also take those notes during. So just something to think about. Who can be a recorder for you? We want to see again if there's consensus in the group. So, for example, when we're talking to health practitioners, we might say, is this something that's realistic? So this particular person has said, this is what they do in their practice, but is this something that can be done on a regular basis? Is this realistic to do? And where we have probes, we have probing questions in interview guides. We often have prompts in focus groups, and the prompts are just more about what's your response to that. So kind of that, again, a broader question that might encourage other people to get involved. And I know there's going to be questions about that, but I will move through these last few slides so that I can get a chance to answer your questions. You can ask whatever questions to me or to the rest of the group. Now I recognize that I did say that this was about interviews and focus groups, but I really want to tell you that it's not just about interviews and focus groups. There are plenty other ways to elicit data. So think about, and again, you can read our paper where we talk a little bit more about other data elicitation techniques, but it's not just interviews or focus groups. We do have Look at that. We do have other arts-based ways in which you can collect data. Documents are definitely a thing, and observations are also part of applied qualitative methods. Just we tend not to do them for the extreme amount of time that you might see in an ethnography. So lots of ways to elicit data. And this is an example of, I don't know if you can hear this, but I'm going to play a little bit.
Hi, my name is Ashlyn. I'm not a fourth year double degree student currently studying in Ireland. You might be wondering what it's like to study and live in Dublin, so let me show you around. Dublin is an amazing city to study in, and DCU is great. Between classes, I love to find cozy study spots, like the Tram Cafe. Dublin has so much history and culture to explore, from the beautiful St. Stephen's Green.
So this is a video that was done by a student that is an international student doing a double degree through Brock University and Dublin City University. And so it's a Canadian student, undergraduate student that is currently living in Dublin. And what she does is create a digital story about what her experiences are through academia, as well as the other things that she's able to do during this experience. So if her question was about what is the experience of dual degree students that are doing an international placement, this is a great way to get it. So we can have participants do something like this to help us either through videos or through photos. And oftentimes after you do this, they can send it to you, and you can follow up then with questions that maybe through individual interviews, or they might be over text, phone, email, all of those other ways in which you can collect something. And photo elicitation is the same way. And sometimes you might even give them a camera or ask them to take pictures with their camera if that's available to them prior to your interview, so that then they can bring that with them. And at the interview, you can say, okay, I asked you to take photos about what it's like to be a young mother living in a rural community. Show me some of the pictures that you took that kind of tell me about your life in this context. And then you can ask questions about, well, why did you choose this? And what did you do here? Oftentimes that's known as photo voice as well. But using photos can be an elicitation technique. And body mapping is another interesting technique. It's often used in health. For example, I do work with women that have episodic disabilities and are living with chronic pain. And a body mapping technique may be, and there's lots of different ways to do it, but it might be as simple as outlining a picture of a body and asking them to identify how and where they feel pain. So giving them colored markers or a pen and asking them to mark where they're experiencing their pain. And they can create darker lines or color in darker spaces for pain that's more intense. You might not give them any too much direction, some maybe a little bit of direction, but not overly direct them. And then ask them, so I see that you use the color pink here and you use the color blue there. Was there any reason for that? And maybe there is, and maybe there's not, but different ways in which you can gather that. The other thing that I have here is around timelining. And timelining can be really interesting as well, for looking at something that's happened over a long period of time. For example, women that are experiencing episodic disabilities, I might, and chronic pain, I might ask them over the last year. So if I give them a calendar over the last year and ask them, where during what times do you experience the most pain? And can you mark out on your calendar where that's happened? We often do this with intimate partner violence as well, because it helps people to identify how often something is happening when maybe they're saying it's not happening very often or it's happening very often. And then as they start to map it out, they realize, okay, actually, this is happening more frequently than I thought. And it also gives us space to say, well, you noticed this on this date. Is there a reason why this was particularly important to you? The other way that you can do timelining, and we do this a lot, I think I have even a picture of it here. I did this recently with one of my classes, but we literally just take a piece of paper and say that there's two things that we know for sure. One is that I happen to be born on August 21st. So August 21st is my birthday. So we know this for sure. And we also know for sure, actually, I don't know what day it is, March 19th. And we also know that today is March 19th. So we put these 2 points on a timeline and then ask somebody to identify what are three things that have happened to you in that time that have brought you to where you are today? What are 3 events? And depending on what your research question is, because we definitely want this to be something that is important to their research question, but what are 3 defining events that shaped how you parent? And then they can mark kind of where those are, and you can ask probing questions around what that is. Another technique that's used is called ecomaps. Ecomaps are something that's frequently used in qualitative research, and it helps us to identify who support people are in somebody's community. So here's me in the middle here. So you put the person in the middle and then ask them, oh geez, and then ask them questions around who are important people in their world. What you might ask them then about identifying who are your social systems, who are your support networks. So I have family and friends. I might even break this out further that, I've got 2 brothers, whatnot, who my friends are here. Are my friends my work friends? Are there people at work that influence me that maybe aren't my friends? So we can build these out a little bit more. And then what we want to do is map the relationships between people. And And to label the direction sometimes helps as well. So I would hope that my friend's one would be a more bi-directional experience where I get from them, but they also get from me. And maybe work is something where I give more to them. Although I get paid too, and I really enjoy being here and doing this. So yeah, so I get something from that too. So maybe that's a bi-directional, something that happens bi-directional. But maybe healthcare isn't. Maybe healthcare is something that's difficult for me to access. And maybe I'm going to put a dashed line here or a thin line to represent that this is a broken system. I don't access healthcare. My healthcare needs aren't being met. So I might use a dashed line here. I might use thicker lines to identify those positive things that are happening in my life. So to walk through the participant, walk them through this, and then again ask them questions. Oh, I notice here you've got a really strong relationship with your work colleagues. Tell me more about that. Again, always reviewing what your purpose of your questions, what that was as well, your research question. This is another interesting technique. I do have a paper about this, and I used it to kind of help me understand what was going on in the data. So in found poetry, what I did was take a transcript, and from that transcript, I identified words that were really poignant, and I actually call these turning points. So words that kind of changed the direction of the interview, words that were really telling something new or interesting. And I took all of those words and then put those words together to create a poem. And what that did was help me see what people were saying in a different way. So this could be considered a generation of data, and it could be considered an analysis technique. So I'll leave it there, but it is an interesting, it's interesting. And for the participants who then I took their transcripts and created a poem. For those participants, it was actually really meaningful, not just for the participants, for all of their peers as well, to read the poem to see what I took away from my time with them. So another thing that you want to think about is where will the data be generated? Where you can, I often encourage you to offer choice. So where you go will absolutely influence how the data is generated. So if you're in a busy coffee shop and it's difficult to hear, or they're worried somebody's going to overhear them, that's not great. If you're in a home where you don't feel safe, that's not great for you either. So really thinking about where is the best place. If there is a cost for people to, if you're, for example, having them on campus, and you're bringing them into campus, and there's a cost for either transportation or for parking, make sure that you've put into your budget that you can reimburse them. And again, we want safety for you, for the participant, and both physical safety, but also psychological safety. When will the data be generated? So thinking about, is it important to your research question, to your study purpose, to be doing this at a particular time? So there's two thoughts here. One is that if you're working, for example, with people with traumatic brain injury, maybe doing something in the evening is not so great or chronic pain. It tends to be a time whenever those experiences are worse, and maybe they're not going to be as open with sharing. So thinking about doing something earlier in the day with that group might be helpful. But if you're looking at how people experience working night shifts, it's not going to be helpful to be there during the day. So really thinking about when is a good time to do this. And in your plan, so before you even start to do your data generation, thinking about how it's going to be managed. And again, I would encourage you to go check out the paper that I shared at the beginning. It'll give you lots of guiding questions to help you to think about how you're going to manage this data, especially because there is quite a bit of it, and it's somebody's unique story. So it's really important to safeguard that. So again, thinking about it across this spectrum of even before you do it, and again, remembering things even like consent forms and notes, that this is all part of the data. During whenever you're doing it, also thinking about making sure that you have things like an audio recorder, a notebook, a backup audio recorder. Always take two, because if you don't take two, the one will die. It's just Murphy's Law, and it's going to happen. Also, arts and materials. So if you are going to do something, or you think you even might be open to it, to doing something like body mapping, make sure you have, or timelining, make sure you have a pen and paper there where you can do that. And then afterwards, thinking about where that's going to go in terms of where you're going to store it, that's ethical and in line with York University guidelines or whatever ethical boards you're using. And finally, the sixth question is around how will emotional safety be considered? And again, this is emotional safety for you as the researcher, as well as the rest of the members of your team, including your transcriptionist. So a lot of the work that I do, there's sexual violence, violence against children, sexual violence against children, and that can be really heavy, heavy topics. So to even think about who's transcribing that and how that's going to impact them, and do they have a space where they can debrief with somebody after reading all of that? Because certainly they're not coming at it from the same lens that you are. If you are doing heavy topics, make sure that you have other pieces involved, like extending the time that you're planning to do analysis, because if it's a heavy emotional topic, you're going to need that. Scheduling extra time for debriefing, taking walks, not doing too many, please don't do too many psychologically or emotionally draining interviews in one day. So make sure that you're spacing them over a week by week, rather than doing more than one a day, or more than three in a week even, I think would be a lot. So and also making sure that the emotional safety of your participants is attended to as well, so that you have whatever supports that you need for them, so that you can tell them how to access something, that counseling or another healthcare practitioner if they need it. My key messages are for today are that there are so many considerations. I hope some of these questions helped you to think about what you might do, or reinforce that you've done the right thing, if you're already in this place. So asking these questions, who, what, where, when, and how, can help guide this process of how you generate data. And generation of data can evoke emotion. So really be thoughtful and mindful about the safety of all team members, and including participants within that. I also want to recognize my colleagues, Carly Whitmore, Dr. Carly Whitmore, Dr. Orr, Dr. Vassie, and Dr. Jack, from three different universities, McMaster, Brock, and Erica's in Italy. And we together have created this presentation, and we also included an information sheet based on this presentation. So if you click on this, if you click on this link, I don't know if you can, you might have to take a picture of it rather. But if you take a picture of this link, it should link you to an infographic. I think it's a couple of pages long, maybe 4 pages long, that has this information in it. And along with that, there is an infographic that relates to the first webinar as well, the webinar about creating an EPIC research question. And yeah, I hope that that's helpful.
Thank you very much, Karen, for leading this important conversation about data generation. I'm going to stop the recording, and I believe we already have some questions in the chat, and hopefully we can open up the conversation for a few minutes.